When we first moved into the little cul-de-sac at the edge of Willow Creek, I thought we had finally found peace after years of bouncing between rentals that never felt like home. And I told myself this quiet neighborhood with its manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and families who waved politely as they drove by would be the fresh start my daughter Emily and I desperately needed. But I couldn't have been more wrong, because beneath the white fences and smiling faces lurked an undercurrent of control. And at the heart of it stood our homeowners association president, Margaret Simmons, though most of the neighborhood simply called her Karen behind her back, a woman whose posture was as rigid as her rules, whose painted-on smile could chill the air around her, and whose eyes seemed to burn holes through anyone who dared disrupt her perfect image of order. On our very first day, as movers carried boxes up the walkway, and I struggled to steady Emily's wheelchair over the uneven pavement, Margaret appeared, clipboard in hand, heels clicking against the concrete like a judge entering a courtroom, and without so much as a welcome, she reminded me that the association had strict policies about unsightly clutter being left outside for too long. I nodded politely, swallowing the sting of her words, but Emily, sweet Emily with her brown curls and wide, hopeful eyes, tried to offer a shy wave, only to have Margaret glance down at the chair, purse her lips, and step back as if the sight of my disabled daughter were somehow offensive, and though she quickly masked her disgust with a tight smile, I caught the way her nostrils flared, the way her jaw clenched, and I knew then that our presence had disrupted the fragile perfection she guarded so jealously. Over the following days, I noticed her hovering more often than chance would allow, watering flowers while staring at our ramp, pretending to collect mail, as Emily and I practiced rolling down the driveway, walking. Her tiny dog passed our house at odd hours, as if inspecting for violations, and while I tried to brush it off as coincidence, Emily began to feel the weight of her gaze too, whispering to me one evening, "Mom, why does that lady always look at me like I'm doing something wrong?" And though I reassured her that some people simply don't understand differences, my heart tightened because I knew there was more to Margaret's looks than ignorance. They were judgments, silent condemnations, warnings of a storm brewing. The first letter arrived in our mailbox less than 2 weeks after moving in, a formal notice on HOA letterhead citing our ramp as a nonconforming structure that detracted from the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood, and though the Americans with Disabilities Act was on our side, the letter was clear: remove it or face fines. I spent hours drafting a response, attaching legal proof, and though I won that particular battle, the war had only begun, because from then on, every little detail became ammunition for Margaret. Trash cans not pulled in quickly enough, a garden hose left coiled beside the porch, Emily's laughter carrying across the yard as she played with bubbles in the evening light. All transformed into written complaints, whispered criticisms, or stern visits. What cut deepest, however, wasn't the pettiness of the rules, but the cruelty behind her eyes whenever Emily was present, as if my child's disability were an inconvenience to her perfect picture. And though Emily tried to stay cheerful, coloring chalk rainbows on the driveway, or carefully tending the daisies we planted by the porch, I could see the way she shrank whenever Margaret walked by, could hear the tremor in her voice when she asked me if we should leave, and each time I told her no, that we belonged here as much as anyone, even as doubt gnawed at me. One evening after Emily had gone to bed, I stood at the kitchen window and watched Margaret across the street, her silhouette framed in the glow of her garage light, and there she was, polishing something metallic on her workbench, a gleam of steel catching the light. It could have been garden shears, I told myself, or tools, but when she turned slightly, I realized with a chill it was a handgun, her hands steady, her face calm, her lips moving as if rehearsing a speech, and though I wanted to convince myself she was simply a lawful gun owner like many in the suburbs, something about the intensity in her eyes told me she wasn't just cleaning it, she was preparing for something, and when she glanced toward our house as though sensing my gaze, a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth that made my blood run cold. I pulled the blinds shut, heart pounding, telling myself I was imagining things, but as I crawled into bed beside Emily and kissed her forehead goodnight, I couldn't shake the echo of Margaret's earlier words, whispered so softly under her breath the first day we arrived that I almost thought I misheard her. "Your daughter doesn't belong here." By the time Rachel and her daughter Sophie had lived in Oak Ridge for a month, the neighborhood's initial politeness had curdled into silence, the kind where people wave from a distance but avoid stopping by. And though Rachel tried to convince herself that this was just the way suburban life worked, she couldn't ignore the shadow of Eleanor Brooks, the HOA president everyone called Karen behind closed doors, who seemed to orchestrate every cold glance and whispered comment Eleanor had perfected the art of passive-aggressive warfare, delivering fines with a smile, showing up on doorsteps uninvited, and drafting letters so formal they read more like indictments than reminders. And Sophie, who at 10 years old only wanted to draw on the sidewalk with chalk or spin in her wheelchair down the smooth slope of their driveway, became the unintentional target of Eleanor's wrath. One afternoon, Rachel found a notice taped to her door declaring that wheels scraping against concrete constitute a noise violation, and she almost laughed at the absurdity until she saw Eleanor standing across the street with arms crossed, lips pursed, and that gleam in her eye that told Rachel the woman wasn't just enforcing rules, she was enforcing power, determined to drive them out. Sophie, ever the optimist, tried to wave hello when they passed Eleanor during walks, but the older woman would recoil slightly, as though Sophie's presence was some kind of contagion, and when Sophie befriended a neighbor boy named Daniel, the hostility sharpened, Eleanor marching over to scold Daniel's parents about allowing their child to fraternize with rule breakers, spreading rumors at HOA meetings that Rachel was behind on dues, and muttering under her breath whenever Sophie giggled too loudly. But the incident that made Rachel's heart lurch came one warm Saturday evening when Sophie was playing near the community fountain, laughing as Daniel blew bubbles for her to chase, and Eleanor approached with that clipboard clutched like a weapon, barking that this area isn't for play, it's for aesthetics, before bending down and hissing into Sophie's face words Rachel barely caught, something about broken things don't belong here. And then, in one swift motion, she shoved Sophie's wheelchair backward, sending the little girl's hands scrambling to steady herself as Rachel sprinted forward, fury burning in her chest. Neighbors watched from porches and sidewalks, but none intervened, their eyes darting nervously between Rachel's outrage and Eleanor's smug expression, and though Rachel shouted at her, demanding to know how she could be so cruel, Eleanor merely smoothed her skirt, scribbled something on her clipboard, and walked away, tossing over her shoulder, "Perhaps you should teach your daughter not to damage property," as if Sophie's frightened tears were somehow vandalism. Later that night, as Rachel sat with Sophie and tried to comfort her, she noticed something eerie outside their window. Eleanor pacing her driveway under the flicker of a street lamp, phone pressed to her ear, and though Rachel couldn't hear the words, she saw the way Eleanor's gaze lingered on their house, saw her lips curl in a smile that was anything but friendly, and a shiver ran through her. The next morning, a fresh letter appeared. Threats of escalating fines, accusations of disturbing the peace, and an ultimatum that if Rachel couldn't bring her household into compliance, the HOA would take legal action. But Rachel's fear deepened when she discovered Sophie sitting quietly at the breakfast table, eyes downcast, whispering, "Mom, I don't think she wants me here," and Rachel, fighting tears, swore to protect her daughter no matter what. Still, in the back of her mind, she couldn't forget what she had seen just once, late at night when she drove back from work. Eleanor in her garage again, this time lifting something from a locked cabinet, a cold gleam catching the light, the unmistakable shape of a firearm held with chilling familiarity. And while Rachel tried to dismiss it as coincidence, the way Eleanor's eyes flicked to her car as she passed made it clear this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. Something darker was taking root, something dangerous, and as Rachel closed her blinds and hugged Sophie tighter than usual that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman across the street was planning something far worse than fines or letters. In fact, she felt certain of it when, just before dawn, Sophie woke screaming from a nightmare and Rachel rushed to comfort her, only to glance out the window and see Eleanor standing at the edge of their yard in her robe, motionless, staring directly at Sophie's bedroom window before retreating into the darkness as if she had never been there at all. By the time Claire and her 12-year-old daughter Lily had settled into Maplewood Heights, the neighborhood had become a labyrinth of silent judgments and hidden glances. And while Claire tried to focus on creating a warm, nurturing home for Lily, she couldn't ignore the constant presence of Veronica Hayes, the HOA president everyone whispered about, though few dared speak her name aloud, whose every step through the cul-de-sac carried an invisible authority, a suffocating weight that seemed to judge not only the home's appearance, but the very worthiness of the family living there, and Lily, with her bright eyes and wheelchair decorated in cheerful stickers, became a target for Veronica's rigid obsession with perfection. It started subtly, with sharp words disguised as helpful advice, letters slipped under the door warning of minor infractions, and polite visits that ended with piercing stares and muttered remarks only half heard. But Claire soon realized that this woman's control over the neighborhood was absolute, with neighbors nodding silently at every accusation, afraid to contradict her even when they knew she was wrong. And while Claire tried to shield Lily, she could see the fear growing in her daughter's gaze, the way her shoulders tensed whenever Veronica passed, and the trembling in her hands as she navigated the driveway. Veronica escalated her harassment when Lily befriended a new neighbor boy, Ethan, playing quietly in the yard, and suddenly Claire found herself summoned to the HOA meeting under false pretenses, only to have Veronica publicly scold her in front of the entire board, accusing her of encouraging disruptive behavior and failing to control her daughter, leaving Claire flushed with anger and humiliation, while Lily sat quietly hurt and confused, wishing she could disappear. But the worst moments were yet to come, because late one evening, after Lily had gone to bed and Claire was preparing dinner, she glimpsed Veronica through the curtains, crouched near her garage with a soft glow illuminating her face, and she realized with a jolt that the woman was handling a firearm, polishing it with a meticulousness that sent shivers down Claire's spine, the metal catching the faint light, reflecting a calm determination that made her stomach twist with fear. And when Veronica's eyes flicked toward the house, Claire felt as if the cold gaze pierced her very soul, and for a moment she was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away, knowing that whatever game this woman was playing, it was no longer about HOA rules. The neighborhood itself seemed complicit, with families retreating indoors, windows drawn, whispers stifled, and though a few kind neighbors occasionally offered smiles or small gestures of support, the fear was palpable, the silence louder than any reassurance could be, and Claire began to feel the crushing weight of isolation, knowing that if something happened, she would be forced to face it. Largely alone, she tried to protect Lily in every way possible, walking her daughter to the mailbox, double-checking locks, practicing careful navigation around the yard, but the dread never left, and each day brought new letters, new warnings, small acts of intimidation that chipped away at their sense of safety, from notes pinned to the door claiming violations to quiet confrontations at the sidewalk. Veronica's voice laced with venom as she reminded them that order must be maintained. And while Claire's heart ached to see Lily flinch at every raised hand or angry tone, she refused to show her fear, wrapping Lily in hugs at night, whispering that they were strong, that they belonged, even as doubt gnawed at her resolve. Then came the night that would forever haunt Claire, when she had just tucked Lily into bed and was about to retreat to the kitchen for a glass of water, when she noticed a shadow moving across the living room blinds. Veronica, standing in the faint glow of the street lamp watching them, and for a terrifying moment Claire felt frozen in place, staring as the woman's silhouette remained motionless, unblinking, her presence like a phantom that refused to fade, before she slowly disappeared into the darkness, leaving Claire with a pounding heart, a mind racing with impossible possibilities, and a gut-wrenching certainty that Veronica's obsession was far from over. That night, as she held Lily close, the little girl whispered in a trembling voice, "Mom, do you think she's going to hurt me?" And Claire, swallowing tears she refused to let escape, kissed her daughter's forehead and murmured, "Not while I'm here," even as the shadows outside seemed to whisper otherwise, and for the first time since moving in, Claire realized that the real battle wasn't about rules or fines, it was about survival, and somewhere across the street, Veronica Hayes was already preparing for her next move. When Vanessa and her daughter Mia first thought they had finally carved out a safe corner of Birchwood Lane, the illusion of peace shattered faster than they could imagine, because Marlene Whitaker, the HOA president everyone quietly feared, had made it her personal mission to micromanage every aspect of their lives, And though she presented herself to the neighborhood as a model citizen, to Vanessa it was clear that Marlene thrived on control and intimidation, her presence a constant shadow. That made even the sunniest afternoons feel oppressive. It began with small things: a pointed comment about the color of Mia's wheelchair cushion, a scolding for leaving her scooter by the driveway, a letter warning that her laughter in the yard disturbed the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. And while Vanessa tried to brush it off, Mia's smile began to fade, replaced by a nervous tension that made her shoulders slump and her hands tremble as she rolled herself along the sidewalk. The situation escalated one crisp Saturday morning when Mia, in her usual playful spirit, accidentally wheeled into Marlene's carefully tended rose bushes while chasing a bouncing ball with her friend Jacob, and the sound of shattering stems brought Marlene running, heels clicking against the pavement, her eyes blazing with fury, and before Vanessa could intervene, Marlene's voice rang out across the cul-de-sac, scolding not only Mia but Jacob as well, berating them for reckless destruction, and claiming that some children simply have no respect for order, while the other neighbors who had once waved politely now watched silently, unsure whether to step in or flee from Marlene's wrath. Vanessa felt her heart pound as she rushed forward to protect Mia, gathering her daughter into her arms, pleading with Marlene to calm down, explaining that it was an accident, but the woman's rage was a tidal wave that could not be halted by reason or apology, and Mia, terrified and trembling, hid her face against her mother's shoulder, whispering between sobs that she didn't mean to ruin anything, while Marlene, her lips curling into a cold, mocking smile, leaned in close enough that Vanessa could see the glint of something metallic in her coat pocket, her hand brushing it subtly as she hissed words Vanessa couldn't fully make out, but whose menace was unmistakable. The confrontation drew the attention of the entire street, with neighbors peeking from behind curtains and fences, some whispering to each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief, and the air seemed to thrum with the tension of anticipation, as if everyone subconsciously sensed that this battle of wills was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Vanessa's mind raced, trying to think of a way to defuse the situation, to protect Mia, to somehow restore the fragile semblance of safety they had thought they could find here, and she reached for her daughter's hand, holding it tightly and speaking in a calm, steady voice despite the rising panic in her chest, telling Mia that they would be okay, that people sometimes act out of fear or anger, and that this would pass, but deep down she knew it would not, because Marlene's obsession with control was no passing irritation, it was a consuming fire, one that had already burned through the calm of every other family on the street, leaving them wary, withdrawn, and unwilling to intervene. As Marlene stepped closer, her face twisted with a mixture of disgust and entitlement, Vanessa caught a flash of something that made her stomach twist, the unmistakable outline of a gun tucked into her waistband, partially hidden by her coat, and for a single heartbeat the world seemed to freeze. The neighbors holding their collective breath, Mia's eyes wide with terror, and Vanessa's heart pounding like a drum in her chest as she realized that the woman standing before them was no longer just an overbearing HOA president, but a threat that could harm her daughter in ways Vanessa had only ever feared in nightmares. She tried to steady her voice, pleading once more for reason, reminding Marlene that Mia was a child, that accident happened, but Marlene's calm, icy exterior betrayed none of the inner conflict Vanessa had hoped to appeal to, and in fact, the closer she came, the more her cold smile widened, the more the neighbors recoiled, unable or unwilling to stop her, and Vanessa realized with a sinking dread that there would be no third party to intervene this time, and just as the tension reached a nearly unbearable peak, with the air around them thick and taut, like a drawn bowstring, Marlene paused, her finger brushing against the gun, and in that heartbeat of terrifying stillness, Vanessa felt the world tilt, the seconds stretching like hours, and Mia clung to her mother, sobbing quietly, whispering in a voice too small to carry across the street, "Mom, what is she going to do?" And though Vanessa tried to reassure her, tried to summon words of comfort, she felt the icy grip of fear closing around her, knowing that the next move would set the course of their lives irrevocably, that this ordinary suburban morning had become the prelude to something far darker, and as Marlene's lips parted and a sharp word cut through the silence like a knife, Vanessa knew in the depths of her soul that there would be no turning back from the moment she had feared from the day they moved in. It was a bright, deceptively calm afternoon when Hannah and her daughter Zoe stepped out into their front yard, thinking that a few minutes of sunshine might lift the cloud of tension that had been building around their home on Cedar Ridge Lane. But little did they know that the storm had already arrived in the form of Patricia Langley, the HOA president whose reputation for control and intimidation had long haunted every street in the neighborhood, and whose obsession with order had turned personal, focused now entirely on Zoe, whose wheelchair, decorated with cheerful decals, only seemed to provoke Patricia further. As Zoe laughed softly while chasing a soap bubble that floated across the grass, Patricia stormed onto the lawn with her clipboard still clutched tightly, her heels clicking sharply, a predatory look in her eyes, and without warning, she began berating them, accusing Zoe of damaging the neighborhood's tranquility and claiming that her presence alone was a disruption to the aesthetic harmony we all value. And though Hannah tried to shield her daughter, stepping in between them, Patricia's anger had reached a tipping point, her voice rising harsh and unforgiving as she gestured wildly, each word cutting through the warm afternoon air with surgical precision, until in a terrifying instant she reached into her coat and produced a gun, her fingers steady, her face expressionless. And before Hannah could react, a deafening crack split the silence, echoing across the cul-de-sac as the bullet struck Zoe's leg. Hannah screamed, rushing forward as her heart seemed to stop, dropping to her knees beside her daughter, whose face twisted in shock and pain, tears streaking her cheeks, blood pooling on the grass beneath her wheelchair, and the sound of her sobs mingled with Hannah's frantic calls for help as neighbors spilled from their homes, paralyzed by fear and disbelief, some instinctively moving to shield their own children, others frozen, unable to comprehend the violence unfolding in their once peaceful street, and all the while Patricia stood a few feet away, gun still in hand, lips curling into a cruel smile, her eyes scanning the chaos she had created, seemingly unfazed by the blood on the grass, unbothered by the terror she had inflicted, and whispering words that made Hannah's stomach turn. Maybe now she'll earn her place. Maybe now she'll finally be quiet. Hannah held Zoe tight, cradling her injured leg, pressing her hands to stem the bleeding while whispering desperately for her daughter to stay calm, to breathe, to hold on, even as Zoe whimpered in disbelief, shaking and clutching her mother's arms, her small body trembling with a mixture of fear and pain, and the surreal horror of it all made every second stretch into an eternity. Then, as Patricia's cold smile lingered, Hannah heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots pounding across the street, the rhythmic, powerful stride of someone trained, disciplined, unrelenting, and her heart skipped a beat, hope flickering amidst the terror, because it could only be one person. Zoe's father, a former Marine named Ryan, whose protective instincts were unmatched, who had always promised to be there for his daughter no matter the danger, and in that moment, the sight of him rounding the corner, eyes blazing with fury, hands reaching instinctively for the weapon he carried at all times, sent shockwaves through the scene, freezing Patricia for a brief, crucial moment as she registered that her carefully orchestrated act of intimidation had just collided with a force she had not anticipated. Neighbors gasped, some instinctively ducking behind fences or shrubs, others staring wide-eyed at the confrontation. But Hannah barely registered any of it, her focus entirely on Zoe, whose sobs mingled with the sound of sirens, now faintly wailing in the distance, as someone, finally, mercifully, had called 911, and Ryan, moving with the precision and authority of a trained soldier, positioned himself between Patricia and his daughter, his presence commanding, silent yet absolute, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to strike, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed suspended, the air thick with tension, with the weight of unspoken consequences hanging over them all, Patricia realizing too late that the family she had tormented was not as helpless as she assumed, that beneath the fragile appearance of vulnerability lay a force she could not possibly control, and as Hannah clutched Zoe, whispering prayers through her tears, Ryan's eyes locked on Patricia, a warning and a promise in his gaze, and the scene froze on the cusp of chaos, the aftermath inevitable, leaving everyone, neighbors, mother, daughter, even Patricia herself, poised on the knife edge of fear and justice, knowing that nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. As soon as Cole arrived on Maplewood Drive, heart pounding and senses razor sharp from years of Marine training, he saw his daughter Ava on the ground, clutching her leg in pain, blood pooling beneath her wheelchair, and his blood boiled with a mixture of terror, rage, and unshakable determination, and every instinct he had honed through deployments and survival drills screamed at him to protect her at all costs, to neutralize the threat standing only a few feet away. Felicity Carr, the HOA, president whose obsession with control had spiraled into violence, whose smug confidence and icy demeanor had just moments ago culminated in the unthinkable act of shooting his child, and though neighbors stared from doorways and behind curtains, frozen by fear, Cole's mind moved faster than anyone could perceive, calculating, positioning, commanding, every step deliberate, his eyes locked on Felicity as she fumbled with the gun in her hand, suddenly realizing that her carefully planned intimidation had collided with a force far beyond what she had imagined, and in that instant her confident smirk faltered, replaced with a flicker of fear that Cole could see as clearly as day, and he advanced with controlled precision, his voice firm but calm, ordering her to drop the weapon, his every movement radiating authority, discipline, and unyielding resolve, while Ava, trembling but trying to stay conscious, looked up at her father, eyes wide with relief and fear, murmuring, "Dad, you're here." And Cole's heart ached at her vulnerability, steeling him further, every fiber of his being focused on ensuring that no harm came to her again. The neighbors whispered nervously among themselves, some daring to peek from behind fences, others ducking behind shrubs. And even as the chaos of the moment swirled around them, Cole's presence brought a strange clarity, a magnetic tension that froze Felicity in place, her attempts to speak interrupted by the commanding tone of his voice, the undeniable authority in his posture, the unmistakable signal that he would not hesitate if she moved in the slightest threatening manner, and though she tried to regain composure, brushing a strand of hair from her face and feigning calm, the sweat forming at her temples betrayed the panic she could not hide. Cole assessed the situation in a fraction of a second, noting escape routes, potential risks, the positioning of neighbors, and, most importantly, the safety of Ava, who whimpered, softly as he gently lifted her into his arms, murmuring reassurances that only a father could give, even as the adrenaline coursed through his veins, sharpening his focus to a razor's edge. And for a moment, it was as if the entire neighborhood held its collective breath, the air heavy with anticipation, fear, and the electricity of impending action, waiting to see who would falter first. Felicity, now visibly shaken, attempted to justify herself, claiming self-defense, accusing Ava of provoking her voice quivering despite her efforts to sound steady. But Cole, unwavering, called her bluff with a calmness that was terrifying in its intensity, his hands steady, his gaze unflinching, each word measured, precise, and carrying the weight of someone trained to assess threats and neutralize them without hesitation. And as he slowly inched closer, the tension stretched taut between them, a silent battle of wills, the outcome hinging on the next move. Neighbors finally began to murmur, some stepping forward cautiously, emboldened by Cole's presence, others still frozen in fear. And in the midst of this charged atmosphere, Ava clutched her father's neck, tears streaking her face, whispering to add, "I'm scared," and Cole tightened his hold, whispering back that she was safe now, that no harm would come to her while he was there, even as his mind raced through contingencies in case Felicity made any sudden, dangerous move, because he knew her obsession with control and perceived superiority could drive her to irrational extremes. Then came the sound that both Cole and the neighbors had been anticipating, distant sirens, growing louder as the local police raced toward the scene, and Cole's body tensed further, knowing that reinforcements were near, but that in these final moments before law enforcement intervened, he alone was the barrier between his daughter and the woman who had crossed every line imaginable, and Felicity's eyes darted toward the approaching lights, realizing that her control over the situation was slipping, that the world she thought she commanded with fear was crumbling, and for the first time, the air around her felt threatening, oppressive, and inescapable. Cole's stare never wavered, every muscle primed, his voice steady, warning her one last time to drop the weapon. And as the flashing red and blue lights drew closer, illuminating the street in stark contrast to the fading daylight, Felicity's resolve faltered entirely, her hand shaking, the gun lowering slightly, While Cole's heart pounded, mind calculating the final moments before law and order arrived, and Ava, still clutching him, let out a small, shaky breath, sensing the shift, feeling the safety her father's presence had suddenly imposed, while the neighborhood collectively exhaled, caught between relief and residual fear, knowing that the confrontation that had terrorized their street for months was finally nearing its climax, and that no matter what happened next, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, with Cole standing as both shield and judge, the ultimate protector of his daughter, the embodiment of unwavering love and lethal precision, holding the line until the law intervened. By the time the flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet cul-de-sac in streaks of urgency, Nathan and his daughter Lily had begun to breathe more steadily, though the adrenaline still thrummed in their veins. And as the first police officers jumped from their vehicles, guns drawn, ready to secure the scene, Karen Mitchell, the HOA president whose obsessive control had turned violent, stood frozen in place, her earlier arrogance replaced by a flicker of fear and confusion as the officers moved swiftly to disarm her and secure the weapon she had wielded so recklessly just moments before. Nathan, a former Marine whose training had prepared him for unimaginable scenarios, kept his eyes on Karen while gently helping Lily to her wheelchair, murmuring reassurances, holding her close as paramedics rushed to assess her wound and stabilize her leg. And though her tears mingled with relief, she felt the weight of the nightmare slowly lifting as she realized her father was truly there, keeping her safe, embodying the promise he had always made to protect her, no matter the cost, while the neighbors emerged from their homes cautiously, murmuring among themselves, some offering sympathetic smiles, others shaking their heads in disbelief. As the truth of Karen's months-long harassment began to unfold under the watchful eyes of law enforcement, the officers quickly took statements, recording the months of intimidation, harassment, and threats that Nathan and Lily had endured. While Karen tried feebly to manipulate the narrative claiming self-defense, her words flailing against the weight of evidence, neighbors' testimonies, and the undeniable truth of her actions, and as she was finally handcuffed and led to the waiting patrol car, her smirk had vanished, replaced by the dawning realization that her obsession with control had finally caught up to her, that justice, long delayed, was now unavoidable. Nathan stayed by Lily's side as paramedics carefully treated her wound, cleaned the blood, and applied bandages, his hand resting firmly on hers, and Lily, though exhausted and frightened, managed a weak smile, whispering to add, "I knew you'd come," and Nathan kissed her forehead, whispering back, "I'll always come, always protect you," as the weight of the ordeal slowly began to lift, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to feel hope, the sense that the nightmare could finally end. Neighbors, emboldened by the police presence, began to share their own stories of Karen's controlling behavior. Warnings ignored, fines levied unfairly, lies spread to intimidate others, and as the officers listened, the community realized that the tyranny of one woman had been broken, that the silence and fear that had gripped them for months could now transform into support, connection, and shared relief. And Nathan, holding Lily's hand, glanced around the street, seeing faces that had once avoided them now nodding in quiet solidarity, a reminder that even in darkness, courage and truth could inspire change. As paramedics helped Lily into the ambulance for further care, Nathan followed, staying close, whispering comfort and love, reminding her that she was safe now, that no one would ever harm her again. And in that moment, the chaos of the afternoon transformed into a powerful testament to family strength, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his child, a bond that had faced unimaginable fear and emerged stronger. Later at the hospital, as doctors carefully monitored Lily, Nathan and his wife, Emily, who had been by their daughter's side since the first harrowing moments, sat holding hands, exchanging tearful glances, each grateful for the other, for their daughter's survival, and for the justice that was finally unfolding against Karen, whose arrest and impending trial would serve as a stark warning that cruelty and obsession could never triumph over love and courage. As Lily rested, bandaged and exhausted but safe, Nathan and Emily whispered words of reassurance, telling her how proud they were of her bravery, how nothing she had done had caused the attack, and how she had survived because of her strength and their unwavering love. And though the memory of the shooting would linger, it became tempered with hope, a symbol of their unity, resilience, and the protective power of a family unwilling to let fear dictate their lives. The neighborhood, once silenced by intimidation, slowly began to breathe again, neighbors stepping forward to support one another, children playing once more in yards that had been shadowed by fear, and Nathan, holding Lily as she sipped water and smiled faintly, realized that the nightmare had finally ended, that Karen Mitchell's reign of terror had been broken, and that while scars, emotional and physical, would remain, the love, courage, and unyielding protection of a family had prevailed. And as the camera of imagination lingers on their faces, Nathan's eyes glinting with resolve, Lily's small hand gripping his, Emily wiping tears from her cheeks, the final thought lingers with the audience. Karen thought Lily was helpless, that her obsession could bend them to her will, but she never counted on the strength of family, the courage of a father, and the resilience of a daughter. And in the quiet aftermath, as the ambulance pulled away and the police secured the street, the story closes with an unshakable truth. The most powerful force in the world is love and protection when combined with unwavering courage.